Mr. Little here, and today we're going to take a look at Chapter 30, Part 3, that is New Societies in the Age of Independence. Essentially, we're going to have a look at some social change that takes place in the Americas from independence up until the 1900s. When looking at this particular presentation, we're looking at changes of political rights and civil rights, changing hierarchies and places within those hierarchies, as well as examples of migration, the big theme in Unit 5 and 6. So by the end of this presentation, you should be able to answer the two following questions. One, how did societies in the Americas demonstrate change and continuity after the Age of Revolutions as it relates to social and cultural organization? And two, how did the changing global economic order, imperialism, and the Industrial Revolution impact the societies of the Americas? That said, let us start with the United States. One of the things that changed from the initial Age of Independence was an increase in the franchise. By the 1900s, more people in the United States could vote than had immediately after independence. Property qualifications had almost been abolished in every state by the 1860s, and a handful of states in the West had given women the right to vote. After the United States Civil War, the federal government launched what it called Reconstruction. This was ostensibly to rebuild the U.S. South, which had been devastated from 5 years of civil conflict, as well as to expand the rights of former slaves to make them full participating citizens. The 15th Amendment, which attempted to create universal male suffrage, that is, all men could vote regardless of their skin color. This situation only lasted as long as the victorious Northern troops occupied the South for about 9 years, but it's worth noting that in those 9 years, former slaves did exercise the right to vote and even elected the first African-American representatives to the U.S. Senate. One of the reasons why the 15th Amendment and black suffrage failed to take hold was resistance from local politicians and local groups who did not believe that they were on par with former slaves. They were part of that racism that comes with 400 years of a slave trade, but also because the question of political rights didn't go with the question of economic rights. There was a lot of effort to get former slaves farmland or territory that they could use to build an economic base or have economic independence. The idea was they were going to break up the plantations and give some land to all the former slaves. So something called 40 acres and a mule. Now, that didn't end up happening. The Northern general who had put forward that idea was not able to enforce it, and the government quickly walked it back. But what happened was, because even freed slaves did not have any sort of economic base to stand on, a lot of them just ended up going back to work for their former masters in what we call sharecropping. And this becomes a form of debt bondage. Many former slaves found themselves sort of wrapped up in this cycle of debt bondage, although some of them sought to physically escape the South where they had been enslaved by moving out west. These were known as the exodusters, sort of named after the Exodus because they wanted to move out west to escape the situation. Some of them even signed up to be soldiers in the U.S. Army, where they were commonly known as Buffalo Soldiers and served in segregated units. You might know that phrase as Buffalo Soldier. Bob Marley made a very famous song about it. One of the other biggest social changes in the United States was the continued push west and settlement of Western North America. This was helped in part because of two government acts. One was the Homestead Act, which essentially gave away land to anybody who would go settle it. All you had to do was get out there and you could have the land. The Transcontinental Railroad, which was sponsored in part by the U.S. government, these developments allowed for a quicker settlement of the West. You also have large groups of individuals going west, such as groups of people who would become known as the cowboys and who actually got their way of life from Mexican cowboys who worked on the ranches of California and the Southwest. These areas, even though we know them today as big farming regions, at the time they were mostly cattle ranching. And so cowboys, or vaqueros in Spanish, made a life working on the cattle ranches, which supplied beef to all the growing cities of the United States. One other really interesting group that ended up moving out west a little bit before the Civil War was the Mormon religious community, which had grown up in what is now Illinois and Missouri. Whether Mormonism is part of Christianity or its own religion not connected to Christianity is hard to say, but Mormons themselves would say that they are a denomination of Christianity. However, they had a number of practices that made them not very well liked by the people of Illinois and Missouri, and so their communities were continually oppressed, and their leaders were killed and thrown in prison, and so the Mormon religious community moved out west to where we know as Utah, to the Salt Lake City region, for their religious freedom. All of this settlement, of course, did not go unchallenged. Many Native American tribes resented having to give up land and resented the increasing presence of these settlers. And this resulted, as I said before, in a number of conflicts that once they were ended, Native Americans were forcibly removed to reservations where they would live in a delineated area. Their children would be taken to boarding schools where they would be forced to learn English, not allowed to use their native language or dress in their Native American dress. The idea was we have to Christianize and Westernize these Native Americans. As one administrator of a school Rule said, save the man, kill the Indian. One of the ways they tried to do this was by introducing the game of football, which was at this time becoming very popular around colleges. And in particular, the Carlisle Indian football team, which I have a picture of them up here in the top right-hand corner, actually became one of the best football teams in history. And if they were still around today, they'd be one of the top 10 college football teams of all time based on their win-to-loss records. It's actually their story, if you want a really interesting football story, I recommend looking up the story of the Carlisle Indian football team. The United States is widely known as a nation of immigrants, and it's around this time that we get this reputation as an immigrant nation. Today, it seems to many observers like the U.S. has a lot of immigrants. Some people even claim that we have more immigrants in the 21st century than we've ever had before. But for comparison, in 2020, only 12% of the United States population was foreign-born, whereas in 1890, 15%, 1 in 7 people, was born outside of the United States. We have been here before. Now, most immigrants came to the United States because they were seeking to escape some sort of violence in their home, or they might have been escaping economic change that was disrupting their way of life. So, for example, deindustrialization, land enclosure, the wars of unification in Europe, the Taiping Rebellion in southern China, all of these events, as well as the opportunities such as the gold rush, or the thought of potentially getting a farm of one's own, drove many immigrants to come to the United States. And while some of them went out into the West, many of them simply stuck to the major cities, which is where we get our big ethnic enclaves that formed in part because most cities at this time had laws restricting the physical location of immigrants to certain parts of town. This was particularly true of Chinatowns. San Francisco is the oldest Chinatown in the United States. The citizens of San Francisco did not want to have to live nearby Chinese people, and so they forced them to stick to a very particular district that eventually grew up into the Chinatown that we know today. So ethnic enclaves were in part because there's a certain networking benefit that can help immigrants adjust to a new situation, but also simply because the unwelcome attitude of many individuals. American anti-immigrant sentiment is common. In the 1830s, there was even a political party that was explicitly anti-immigrant called the Know Nothing Party. And the Ku Klux Klan, although we normally associate them with preventing former slaves from practicing their political rights after Reconstruction, they were also notoriously anti-immigrant. Anti-immigrant hysteria reached such a point that in 1882, the United States simply banned all Chinese immigration to the U.S. in something known as the Chinese Exclusion Act. And no new Chinese were allowed to come into the United States until the 1940s. So anti-immigration sentiment is nothing new, historically speaking, nor is it limited to the United States. Australia had a similar policy when it came to Asian migrants. Now, as I said before in the previous presentation, the states of Latin America were very socially diverse. They had a number of positions and hierarchies. So you might remember from the revolutions episode that once the revolutions were over and the peninsulares went back to Europe, the criollos sought to lead their new nations under the mantle of enlightenment. They wanted to essentially turn their states into states like Europe. Urban criollos who were concentrated in cities such as Buenos Aires, which was called the Paris of Europe. All of the food and raw materials that many of these nations exported went to pay for creation of cities with classic architecture and large concert halls, the idea being that we're going to make our cities look like Europe. Criollos were very much in favor usually of free trade and free enterprise, and they wanted rational use of the land. This clashed sometimes with both Native Americans, but also the horse riders of the plains. In Argentina, specifically, they're called the gauchos, horsemen who worked with livestock and animals. They didn't want the southern plains of Argentina to be fenced in or limited in any way, shape, or form. And so these two groups clashed on the political scene, even though the criollos tried to use the gaucho as a romantic symbol of the nation. Balancing this was a tricky act. And this is, again, where caudillos played a pivotal role in the history of Latin America and prevent Argentina from fragmenting into potentially two different states. The independence of Latin American countries did not necessarily mean good things for the Native American communities. Latin American countries abolished royal tribute or labor demands, so that would be like royal taxes or the mita system. They often just replaced it with heavier regular taxes. And whereas Native Americans might have paid their taxes in labor before, now they had to come up with some way to pay their taxes in silver versus paying taxes in kind. The idea is that you have to pay your taxes with one specific currency, which forces Native Americans to work within the economic system that is being created. And the privatization of communal lands, which was something that the new Latin American states also did, meant that it was much easier for them to deprive Native Americans of their lands. Individual Native Americans could sell their lands, their particular plot of land, or their particular plot of land could be taken from them, versus communal land that was supposed to be for all Native Americans and had been guaranteed under the Spanish crown, put Native Americans at a distinct economic and social disadvantage in these new states. And in general, most criollos viewed Native Americans as outsiders needing to be modernized. They might have romanticized them or thought of them as the original inhabitants of Latin America, but that didn't change the fact that they needed to be modernized. They needed to give up their Native American ways and become farmers if they weren't already. There were those who questioned or rejected the social order, such as the famous preacher Antônio Conselheiro in Brazil, who formed a community of landless peasants, uprooted indigenous people, former slaves, and jobless mestizos in the backwoods of Brazil called Canudos. I believe I'm pronouncing that correctly. And he formed sort of a utopian community centered around Christianity, as well as a rejection of private property. And this city grew very large. I think it reached at its peak 30,000 people. They abolished private property. They abolished currency. Everybody did a certain amount of work every day, and everybody got a certain amount of food. It was very similar to those utopian socialist visions we talked about in Europe right after the Industrial Revolution, which is a nice reminder that ideas that critiqued the system of capitalism that came out of the Industrial Revolution are not limited to Karl Marx or Europeans. Many people made these observations, observed that there were problems with this new social economic order that came out of the Industrial Revolution. Latin America also witnessed a great deal of immigration. We don't normally associate Latin America with immigration, but there was about as much, if not more, as there was in the United States. So, for example, because the populations of many of these new states was actually relatively small, many new Latin American countries encouraged immigration from Europe. In fact, it's in the Argentine Constitution of 1853. They were trying to get more immigrants to come from Europe. So much so that they said, we're never, ever going to put any kind of ban on immigration to Argentina. And as a result, huge numbers of Southern Europeans came to Brazil and Argentina. Italians in particular came to Argentina in large numbers, in part encouraged by recruiters who would go to the poorer parts of Italy and say, I know a place where you can make your fortune. It's called Argentina. So much so that 60% of the people in Argentina today are of Italian descent in some way, shape, or form. On the other side of South America, along the Pacific coast, Peru and Chile, who were building their economies on exporting raw materials, including guano and nitrates and copper mining, also needed a large labor force, so sought to bring Chinese immigrants to places like Peru in order to work in the mines, as the majority of the indigenous labor force was living in the Andes. And so South America also sees the rise of Chinatowns, just like in the United States. So Barrio Chino de Lima, which is the Chinatown of Peru, is actually the second oldest in the entire Western Hemisphere. And this was not necessarily free labor, if you will. Sometimes it was forced labor, sometimes it was coerced. Sometimes it was done via a contract, but the contracts weren't always on the up and up. They weren't always legitimate. Sometimes the contractors would cheat the laborers out of their wages or their rights. There was also a practice of just straight up kidnapping people known as Shanghaiing, named after the city of Shanghai in China because it happened there so often, not just the Chinese, but also to sailors of other navies and other people of ill repute would kidnap individuals to serve in various labor roles in other parts of the world. In the Caribbean islands, which I know we haven't really talked about yet because they didn't gain their independence and they remained part of most European empires, after the suppression of the slave trade, the abolition of slavery meant that there needed to be a new labor force to work on the sugar plantations. In the case of the British and Dutch possessions, they contracted out labor companies from India to bring Indian workers to the Caribbean. And this is where we get the modern Indo-Caribbean identity, as can be seen with the new US Vice President Kamala Harris, whose parents are of Indo-Caribbean descent. In Cuba, the Spanish also needed another labor force, and so they began to import laborers from China under contract. And at one point, there were 100,000 Chinese in Cuba. And many of the Chinese Cuban descendants are still there today, and they are an integral part of the Cuban identity. For example, there was a 10-year war for independence, which was eventually defeated. But there is a monument that's in Havana still, which reads that there was not one Cuban Chinese deserter and not one Cuban Chinese traitor, showing that immigration from Asia in North and South America is in part because of the new demands of the economy, as well as seeking opportunity. Because remember that in China at this time, there was a great deal of instability in the form of the Taiping Rebellion, the Opium Wars, ecological stress and famine. So what about women in the age of independence? Well, in Latin America, there was some shifts, there were some changes. So for example, with the caste system abolished, officially women were equal to men. However, culturally, gender roles tended to stay the same. You might have heard the phrase machismo, referring to the cultural stereotype of Latin America in which men are in charge and women are not. And this was something that women in the newly independent Latin American countries had to deal with. And while there were some economic opportunities and continuities, so for example, women continued their role as small vendors and business people in major cities, there is some evidence that the growth of the export industry did give some areas of Latin America a higher percentage of female landowners than had previously been. So one study showed that in Nicaragua, the growth of the coffee export industry in the late 1800s actually resulted in more female landowners than male landowners in that particular part of the world. And women also took part in social activism in both the United States and in Latin America. Clorinda Mato de Turner, famous writer from Peru, wrote several books that critiqued the abuse by landowners against their Native American laborers, and in general advocated for better treatment of the Native Americans. In the United States, women were expected to take up a very, very particular role, that is of promoting democratic values through something called Republican motherhood, by which mothers would instill the values of the Republic in their children. However, this was not always the reality. As I mentioned before, women often formed the first industrial workforce, so the Lowell mill girls helped spur the industrialization of the United States. Women also continued to be active in many reform movements across the United States, such as the anti-slavery movement, the temperance movement, which was against alcohol, as well as just pushing for more property rights for women and men. Sojourner Truth, who was a former slave and activist her entire life, fought in many of these campaigns. She gave a speech entitled "Ain't I a Woman?" which rhetorically asked why it is that women still didn't have the same rights as men. There was also, of course, a push for suffrage, that is the right of women to vote, and this was exemplified in the Seneca Falls Convention of 1848. And by 1900, 14 states, mostly in the western part of the United States, had granted women the right to vote. So progress was slow and there were setbacks, but in general, women continue to play a critical role in the formation of these new states in the age of independence. When we talk about the social changes and continuities in the age of independence, it's worth noting that the radicalism of the revolutions, the equality and idea that everyone's created equal, this took a long time to really take hold. By 1900, it was arguably very far from complete. It's still very far from complete today, but it's worth noting that a new sense of agency really had been created by the revolutions. And that's one of the things I talked about in chapter 28 is there's the very quiet revolution within a revolution. Even though the revolution may not necessarily result in everything you want, it does lay the groundwork for future change that can be done. And for everybody involved, the age of revolution, it's sort of a win some, lose some. Slavery was abolished, but in many places, slaves had to continue to work for their former masters. Women gained some new rights they didn't have under Spanish law, but they were also saddled with some new obligations. And migrants found their condition vary depending on where they were. Its opportunity was tempered with legal restrictions, as well as good old-fashioned racism. And the indigenous communities throughout the Americas continued to endure despite the incredible hardships they were facing. So the loss of colonial protections, specifically in terms of guaranteeing common lands, really put them in a difficult place. And the fact that pretty much everywhere, North and South America, they were viewed as an obstacle to be overcome. Native Americans were the problem, not the solution. And this is really interesting, especially with Latin America. We talk about the concept of a Creole identity. The Criollos really emphasized their South American origins, but they tended to downplay or even demonize the Native American elements of that identity. It's something very interesting to keep in mind when talking about identity and nationalism and who belongs. So you should be able to answer those two questions from the beginning of the presentation. I want to thank you for joining me. My name is Mr. Little, and I will see you next time. Hey there. Thanks so much for watching. I hope this video was able to help you. If you appreciate this kind of work, please like and subscribe. And of course, I welcome any kind of feedback or suggestions, so feel free to leave a comment down below. Thanks so much for joining me. I'm Mr. Little, and I'll see you next time.